everyone. Greetings from all of us at Wharton. We're so happy to have you join us for our sixth in the Wharton Ready Livecast Series, where we're bringing you thought leadership from Wharton faculty for topics that are particularly relevant to the challenges we face during COVID-19. And today I'm very pleased to have Professor Martine Haas speak to us about virtual teams, building engagement. And Professor Haas is both Professor of Management and she is the Director of the Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies at Wharton and Penn. And before we start today, I'd like to direct your attention to all of those who are new to how to manage this system. If you see on your right-hand side, the lowest icon is a Q&A. Professor Martine will be asking or will be responding to questions. Please use that to post your questions. And two icons above that is the moderator chat. And if you have any technical challenges, please use the moderator chat to correspond with our backup team who will help you out in need. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Martine. Professor Haas, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning from Philadelphia. I hope you're all well and healthy wherever you are around the world. We're really happy that you can join us for today's session, and I'm excited to be able to talk about virtual teams with you. It's obviously a very topical topic, right, where many of us are working in virtual teams right now. Some of you may have spent a good bit of time in virtual teams before the recent events of COVID-19, but a lot more people are suddenly faced with these challenges, and so it is something that's really top of mind for lots of us. So again, happy to be here to talk with you about some of the research and some of our insights and some ways of thinking about how to work in virtual teams and how to make that as good an experience as it can possibly be, both in terms of making it enjoyable and also making it productive and effective for you and for your organizations. So I'm going to walk us through a set of slides, and then we'll open for Q&A. The slides, by the way, will be available after the session. They'll be available for you, so don't feel like you have to write everything down. So here's the main topics we're going to cover to start off with. We're just going to talk a little bit, make sure we're all on the same page about what virtual teams are, and some about the benefits of virtual teams, why we want to use them, when we want to use them. But really, I'm going to spend most of our time together talking about the challenges of virtual teams, because I think that's what a lot of us really want to know and want to try to figure out how to deal with these challenges, address them effectively, and talk a little bit about what are virtual teams. I think we all have a pretty good sense of this by now, even if we didn't a couple of months ago. Virtual teams means basically that our members are geographically dispersed and pretty much reliant on technology to communicate with each other. Whether that might be, phone, email, video technology, and so on. So it's part of this bigger phenomenon of remote work, right? Which again is something that we're all suddenly much more familiar with, perhaps, than we were even at the beginning of this year. So I know you had many of you to hear from Professor Peter Capelli last week, and he talked about remote work and some of the issues that we're going to be digging into more deeply today. So I think that was a really good setup. I'm not going to spend time really, because he did, talking about sort of the bigger phenomenon of remote work, but we're really going to dig into virtual teams in particular. You'll hear other words for virtual teams. Virtual teams often are international. They're not necessarily. They can just be distributed, for example, across the US. They're often across borders, though. Sometimes they're called global teams. So you'll hear lots of different names. It basically all means the same thing. One thing I just want to note is, teams can be completely virtual. So here we have a team of people who are all in different places, right? Which is kind of the situation that most of us are in right now, right? We're working from home with a team of people who are all working from their own homes, and that team is completely virtual. But very often in many organizations on a more typical basis, teams will be partially virtual. In other words, there'll be kind of clusters. There'll be, we'll be here in Philadelphia. There'll be another cluster who is working in LA. There'll be a cluster who's working in London, a cluster who's working in Asia, and so on. And so, some people are co-located, but some parts of the team are distant. And that's also a virtual team, but it has a slightly different configuration. So how widely used are virtual teams in normal times? The data, there's actually not terribly good data on this. This is data that's kind of a little bit old, but I think it's probably fairly indicative of how things still look, at least again in normal times. So in this survey by the Society for Human Resource Studies, about 46% of the organizations, which were all different sizes in the US, said that they used virtual teams. And this is, not a firm number. I'm just giving you a little bit of a feel for this, because it's also the case, and it makes sense, that organizations that have multinational operations tend to be use virtual teams more. If you're only in the US or only domestic, you tend to use them less. It again makes sense. It's also the case that in for-profit companies, the use of virtual teams tends to be much higher than in government agencies. Again, I wouldn't, hold these numbers are not definitive, but it gives you a bit of a flavor for kind of where you're going to see virtual teams being used most. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits of virtual teams. And, these are in some ways fairly straightforward, but they're worth keeping in mind, right? Because the question is, well, should I be using virtual teams in my organization? When should I use them? Why should I use them? Again, assuming we have a choice, which many of us right now don't, but hopefully we will be back to having some choices over this pretty soon. The benefits of virtual teams, this comes from the same survey, but again, I think it's really pretty representative of the reasons why companies, organizations have been using virtual teams up to now. A very common reason is to take advantage of talent that is in different locations. So again, it may be across the US, very often it's across the world, right? We just want to access certain kinds of knowledge. Maybe it's scientific knowledge, maybe it's people who really understand a particular region or location. And to do that, we essentially, we're not going to bring them all here, but we're going to access them wherever they may be. Another big reason is to boost collaboration, right? Basically so that the organization can learn and share knowledge across the world or across the different parts of its organization more effectively. Some organizations say that they use virtual teams to improve productivity, right? The idea being that people are sometimes, and there's evidence for this, more productive and may work harder and even longer hours from home or from, when they're able to work in their own space or their own hometown even. Minimizing travel costs is a big deal, right? So the costs of flying people in and out all the time, maybe just having somebody in a particular location, in a particular country, can be really helpful. And then lastly, carrying out global projects, right? So increasingly, organizations, again, these are US organizations, but it's going to be true for many organizations, European, Asian, and so on, are faced with a need to actually do projects that have global reach. And for those, it makes sense to for your team to have a global footprint. So there's some, real reasons why using virtual teams makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that, is probably a question that's on many of your minds right now is what's going to happen post-COVID-19. And I think one of the things we may see some additional benefits of virtual teams that we, didn't really have top of mind before. So just to mention a couple of those. One is, I think because we're suddenly realizing, how much virtual teams can be used more than we thought before. There's a big advantage which has to do with the lower costs of office space, and to the extent that a lot of companies are suddenly needing to tighten their belts, this might become more of a consideration, right? So if more of your workforce works from home, you don't need as much office space. That can be a very significant cost saving. And this is something that many companies were already aware of, but it might accelerate as we move back to the workplace. And I think the other thing that that is going to become more top of mind is that for some employees, and by no means is it going to be all, or even necessarily most, it's hard to tell right now, but for some employees, this is going to turn out to be a really attractive way of working, being able to work from home. And so as a result, you might be able to attract or motivate or retain employees better if you give them the option to work from home, and therefore, you'll be having virtual teams more, right? These things, it's motivating because you don't need to commute so much. You can live somewhere that's cheaper. You don't have to live in the city or near your workplace. Gives you much more flexibility over your time as well as where you live. It might help people balance work and family. Overall, maybe it improves people's lifestyles, right? Again, not for everybody, but there might be some set of people for whom this becomes a really good, attractive option and a reason why companies might want to start using virtual teams more. Okay, so there are some real reasons why this is attractive and desirable. Many companies were already doing it. Probably it will, increase as we go forward into a post-COVID world. Let's talk, though, given that virtual teams are already widespread and are going to probably become even more so, let's talk about the challenges that we face working in virtual teams and leading virtual teams. I want to say as we plunge into this, a key thing when we think about leading teams of any kind is to recognize that people who are working on virtual teams, people who are leading virtual teams, are, I'm going to guess, pretty busy on a daily basis, right? Typically pretty overloaded. And you've got lots of things to worry about beyond, whether your team is working. We know that's an important thing, but there are also lots of other pressing things that you're paying attention to. So what I want to do in our time now is to just focus in on some key things. We're not going to be able to cover everything that happens in leading a team or in trying to manage a virtual team. There are many things, and there's a complex set of considerations that go into this. But given how busy everybody is, I think it's beneficial to be able to focus on some really critical things. So we're going to pick out some key challenges of working in virtual teams and talk about how to address those. So the first and the most obvious one, right, is technology, right? Technology is a complete pain in the neck if it's not working for you. And this is not news to anybody at this point. I think we've all been having plenty of experience with this. One thing I would say is, as you think about the technology that you want to rely on and be using regularly to manage and lead your virtual team, we often talk about in the communications literature the fact that some communication media are richer than others, right? There are rich media and there are relatively poor media, right? Or sort of not as informative media. So writing is not a very rich form of medium, right? So if you're communicating via email and so on, there's a lot that doesn't get communicated. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a video technology, right? And video technology is probably the richest form of technology that we have access to at this point. Which means that there's a lot more information that's conveyed. You can pick up your team members' moods. You can pick up when they're disengaged. You can pick up whether they're excited. You can build on each other's ideas fast, right? It's as close to kind of interpersonal interaction as we can get, being virtual or being remote. So thinking carefully about the form of technology that you want to use for different kinds of communication is helpful. Some forms will be efficient and appropriate for just getting some daily tasks done. Sometimes you're going to want to be on much richer communication technology. But basically getting this up and working so that everybody in your team can communicate effectively is a basic requirement, right, for having this work. Okay, so that's an obvious one. Time zones is a pretty obvious one to many of you too, right? Particularly those of you that are calling in from different time zones right now to this call. But if you are working on a team where people are in different time zones, this is something that you really need to pay careful attention to. So much so, and you're going to be aware of it, that I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But again, I think that the key idea here is to be aware of the difficulties that other people may be facing in your team and not assume that it's okay that they're always having to call in at night, for example. A common strategy for dealing with, working on a team that has different time zones is to do what's called sharing the pain, which I'm sure many of you have heard of if you work on these teams, where you basically rotate. So sometimes it's you calling in at night, sometimes it's teammates in another part of the world calling in at night. I think that is generally a really good strategy, but make sure that you really are sharing the pain, right? That you're aware of whether other people actually want to be rotating like that. You might assume that they do, but maybe they do or maybe they don't. So it's always good to have those conversations. A third element to pay attention to, and I've got 4 here. So this is the third of four elements that we're going to just sort of talk about briefly in terms of what's going on in virtual teams and the challenges that we face, is hierarchy, right? And so this is one that I don't know how conscious everybody is of this, but to me it's very striking and very obvious working in a virtual team that you tend to see hierarchy kind of often get exaggerated. So in other words, the team leader or the person who tends to take more of the speaking time gets even more of that in a virtual setting, in a remote setting, partly because it's difficult to just jump in and take turns and that kind of stuff. And so this sort of the important people or the higher level people tend to suck up a lot of the airtime. And that is something, again, that just requires really deliberate attention, right? So as a team leader, are you making sure and really deliberately going out of your way to ensure that all voices are heard and that people don't feel like it's super hierarchical, right? Try to break down those hierarchical barriers, because if you don't, you'll find that people aren't telling you everything, that information isn't flowing well, and so on. We'll get back to this a little bit later on. So hierarchy is number 3, and then number 4, and it's kind of related, is languages, right? So again, if you work on a team where you have people who speak different languages, and mostly I mean, different languages the way we normally talk about language from different parts of the world, but it can also mean different technical languages, right? So if you have an engineer and a marketing person and a human resources person, those are sort of different languages too in their own way. And what that can mean, again, it's actually a little related to the hierarchy idea, is that sometimes people who don't speak the dominant language don't get heard enough, right? Maybe they're a little hesitant to speak up. Maybe people don't give them enough time to kind of get their thoughts out, to really explain what they're trying to say so that everybody can understand it. And they might get brushed over, right? And that's really, again, dysfunctional for a team. You're not taking advantage of all the talent and the knowledge that exists on your team if some people aren't getting heard because they don't speak the dominant language, right? Whether that's English or whether that's marketing, for example. Okay, so I started with all of these things because I think that they are pretty obvious in some ways. If you've been spending time working in virtual teams recently or before now, you're going to be pretty aware of these challenges already, right? And so in some sense, if you think about a virtual team as an iceberg, right, there's a set of things, a set of challenges that are above the water. They're pretty easy to see, and that's where I would put the ones that we just went through. So technology, time zones, hierarchy, languages, if I was just observing a team, any team, I would see pretty quickly that these things were working well, or maybe I would pick up pretty quickly that they were challenges, right? They're surface level things. What I want to move now to for our remaining time is to talk about 2 deeper level challenges that are kind of below the surface of the iceberg. So if I was an anthropologist, right, and I was studying the culture of your team, I would see this kind of superficial things that are going on, but I'd be trying to really understand, well, what's really driving that? What's going on underneath? And so there's 2 deeper level challenges that we know are really important in teams, and a lot of research has been done on these in different ways. I'm going to be talking in particular about some insights that come from research work that I've done with my colleague Mark Mortensen, who's a professor at INSEAD. And we see in virtual teams these 2 problems a lot. Problems related to shared identity and to shared understanding. And they relate to the surface level challenges, but they're deeper. So let me talk about each of these in turn briefly. So the first challenge is this challenge of shared identity in a virtual team, right? So the idea is that if you think about a virtual team, what you want is for everybody to feel like they're all part of the same team, even though you're in different parts of the world, different locations. And very often teams, virtual teams, lack that shared identity. And why is that? Because these virtual teams often have what we call in the research literature subgroups, right? And you can see this pretty easily if you think about those teams that I mentioned earlier on, right? So this is this partially virtual team where you've got, 3 sets of people in different locations. It's basically really easy for those 3 sets of people to form little subgroups within the team as a whole. But you can also see it even in a team that's completely virtual. Remember, this is the team I showed you earlier where everybody is in a different location. And here you can still get subgroups forming. It's not as easy because you're not in the same location, but often people will form subgroups because they're similar to each other in some ways. Often that'll be around the kind of work they do, right? So maybe it's, the marketing people are the dark blue people and, the tech people are the purple people, for example, right? There could be other bases to form these subgroups, but that's a very common one in virtual teams. And so why do these subgroups matter? They matter because they get in the way of the shared identity, right? So what happens is we tend to get into these dynamics that are really rooted deeply in social psychology, right? Social psychology tells us that people tend to categorize themselves and others, right? And we tend to then assume that people who are in a different category from us are all similar to each other, right? This is kind of the basis of stereotypes. And we also tend to assume we have something called an in-group bias, right? We tend to assume that we're good and other people not so good, right? Or not working so hard, or not as talented, or not as knowledgeable, right? And so in a virtual team, we often, as part of this natural psychological process, we tend to get into this kind of us versus them dynamic, right? Us over here in Philadelphia, them over there in London or LA. So why does this matter? Because it leads to some really dysfunctional consequences, right? Reduced motivation to work together, right? So this us versus them mentality tends to mean we don't really trust each other in a different part of the team. We don't feel like it's psychologically safe. In other words, safe to tell each other things that could put ourselves at, maybe we did something wrong. Maybe we're reporting a mistake. Maybe we're reporting something we don't feel confident about. But we don't feel confident doing that in a team that doesn't have a real shared identity. Maybe we withhold information rather than sharing it. Worst case scenario, we also, we sometimes get conflict within a team between the different parts, the different subgroups of the team. But this is that problem of shared identity. Let me talk briefly about the problem of shared understanding. So shared understanding is related, but it's a little different, right? It's not so much about do we sort of see ourselves as part of the same team, part of the same whole, but it's really about do we understand each other, right? And can we share information effectively? And the problem here is that virtual teams often lack a common ground. In fact, they often lack shared information, right? Different parts of the team have different information. And they often lack shared context, right? We're all operating in slightly different worlds with different resources and different constraints, and we don't really understand what's going on with each other. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because it can really reduce not our motivation so much, but our ability to work together, right? It's very easy to miscommunicate, to misinformation. There can be what are called mutual knowledge gaps, which means that, I sort of think you know something, but I'm wrong, right? I sort of assume that we all have the same knowledge. There can be mistakes and inefficiencies. There can be overlooked opportunities. So these are sort of these two deep underlying things that we often see in virtual teams, a lack of shared identity and a lack of shared understanding. And they can drive a lot of the dysfunctional dynamics that we then have to deal with. So let me just close now. I'm going to show you two slides that are kind of action-oriented. What can you do to build shared identity and build shared understanding in your team? And then we'll open up for questions. So what's a leader to do? There are a large range of possible options, or ways that you can think about trying to build shared identity and shared understanding in your team. And some of those will relate to the surface level challenges and will be facilitated if you get the surface level stuff right. But still, the key is you really need to pay attention to these challenges. So shared identity, how can we build shared identity in a team? Here are just an array of suggestions, and we can talk about more in the Q&A if you'd like. So shared identity, what can you do? I mean, you want to think about how to build an overarching goal for your team that everybody knows about and everybody buys into, right? It's great if you can to launch your team in person. It's always great if you're working in a virtual team to be able to meet in person, or at the beginning, extra important if you can launch the team in person. But then emphasizing team goals, holding frequent team meetings, making sure everybody understands how they contribute to the goal. Then there's stuff to do with kind of the interpersonal relations on the team and trying not to divide into that us versus them antagonistic relationship. You want to keep stereotypes in check, be inclusive. Video is a really good way to build shared identity, right? Helping people see each other, helping people see where each other is working, operating, virtual tours, showing each other around your office space, your workspace. It's just ways of kind of getting to know each other. Sharing that 24/7 burden, right? So to do with the time zones thing again, showing that everybody matters and is an important part of the team. Building in social time or unstructured time to chat. Celebrating successes for the team as a whole, and again, meeting in person regularly. Those are all things that you may have heard about in different ways, but here I think, hopefully you can see why they're important, right? They help us to build shared identity in the team, which is fundamental for that motivation to really trust each other and work together effectively. And then building shared understanding, what can we do for that? A lot of this is about communicating well and effectively and often. Scheduling regular meetings, using multiple collaboration tools, whatever is the most appropriate way to communicate. paying extra attention to those who are on the phone or video or non-dominant language speakers or lower status in the hierarchy. So it connects back to those surface level challenges. Make sure that you're getting input from everybody, right? Everybody's information is heard and shared. Consider team members' other commitments, understand what else they have going on, and what context they're working in, what kind of constraints or resources they may have in their context. Inviting everyone's input, soliciting diverse and dissenting opinions. So these are all ways of making sure that all the information, all the knowledge, all the expertise, all the ideas are on the table regularly, all the time in your teams. Okay, so with that, let me summarize and then I'll turn over for questions. Key takeaways here. Leading virtual teams, I strongly believe, and there's a lot of evidence, is even more challenging than leading traditional teams, which are pretty challenging in the first place. Virtual teams have important benefits, including the ones we discussed briefly, managing talent, collaboration, productivity, and so on. But they also have these substantial challenges, right? Both surface level challenges that are relatively obvious and straightforward, if not always easy to address, and then these deeper level ones that really require deliberate attention if you're going to address them effectively. So to manage virtual teams successfully, leaders need to pay deliberate and careful attention to addressing these challenges. So with that, I'm going to open us up for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Martine. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Just before we start, I will make note that the presentation and the recording will be made available to everyone post-webinar, so be on the lookout for those. And I do understand we're getting close to the end time. We'll go a couple minutes over to answer a couple of your questions too as well. Martine, a lot of questions coming in on how to onboard new team members and new hires. A lot of people want to get your thoughts on that. If you could elaborate a little more, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, to some extent, we've all been, it's been made relatively easy for us in some sense, having to suddenly go to working from home because we're used to working, many of us, with each other in the office, right? And so it's not so difficult to kind of make this transition. But when you have to onboard people into a virtual team setting and you've never met them before, that's tricky, right? Again, the ideal is to be able to meet in person somehow, right? And to have a team meeting somewhere in the world where these people can meet face to face. But assuming that's not possible, I think you want to get as close to that as you can, right? So using video technology, having a real launch session, right? Maybe the rest of the team has been working together already and you're bringing in a new person. That's what the question sounded like. At a time that is, we are going to welcome this new person to the team at this time of this day. Everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to be on their screens and go around, introduce everybody. Do what you would do if it was a meeting in person, right? So try to get as close to that experience as possible. Help them to understand what the overall goals for the team are, which responsibilities and roles everybody has, how the team works together, right? So some of that you're going to need to individually coach the person on, brief the person on. You can obviously have them set up then times to meet individually with everybody that they're going to be working with, and even with the people they're not going to be spending much time with who are on the team, right? Because that again helps them to understand the team as a whole and to build that sense of shared identity and also shared understanding. So I'd say get as close as you can to the real thing, albeit to the face-to-face version of onboarding somebody, but it will have to be virtually.
We have a lot of questions coming in about cultural barriers as well. Maybe more elaborate on the fact of having diverse viewpoints on certain issues, especially with the pandemic going on. I know even in America, depending on what area of the country you're in, your view could be a lot different as well. So how do we kind of take away cultural barriers as well? How do we keep those into consideration?
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to take them away, right? They're there and they're part of what makes any team potentially really effective, right? Is that you have a diversity of opinions and views, and that should expand the way that you think, right? So I think you don't want to shut that down. You want to embrace it, and you want to make sure that different perspectives are heard, are solicited and are heard and are respected, right? Really important to have everybody feel like their views are understood and respected on their teams. And some issues get very sensitive, right? And so I think then what the research tells us, there's a lot of research on conflict in teams, tells us that it's good to focus on task-based differences and disagreements, right? That kind of conflict, if you're disagreeing about that, can be productive, right? You'll get to a better conversation, a fuller conversation, fuller understanding of the issues. What you don't want to get into is any kind of personal or relational conflict, right? That becomes you and me as individuals and not as kind of team members who are focused on their task. That can be very dysfunctional. So you really want to steer that conversation away. I think that's, in some ways, those are just differences of any kind, right? It's not particularly cross-cultural. Your question was maybe a little bit more, or at least partly on the cross-cultural side. There, I think a lot of the issues come back to those things that I was pointing to earlier about hierarchy and language differences, and really, again, respect, right? Making sure that we listen to each other and make the space, especially in a virtual setting, to really, really slow down and be able to hear each other's perspectives and understand why they think that way and why their viewpoints are what they are, is critical to any kind of team, but particularly in a cross-cultural team.
What key considerations should team members consider while giving feedback? I know a lot of times virtually giving feedback is something that we're still getting used to. What considerations should we keep in mind when giving somebody virtual feedback?
I want to say respect again, right? I think really being understanding of people's perspectives and the reasons why they're behaving the way they are, and asking about that, especially if we're suddenly plunged into this virtual setting, right? And so people are operating right now, and it's true in general at some level in virtual teams, under really different constraints, sometimes difficult constraints, right? Do they have the right workspace? Do they, are they managing work and family and so on? So part of feedback is trying to understand why people might be behaving the way they are, right? What's going on? Is there something else there that you're not seeing as a leader who's trying to give them feedback that could help to explain, right? So don't assume, this is basic psychology again, don't assume it's the person, it might be something about the situation, right? So those conversations, I think, are have to be really extra carefully done virtually. The other thing I would say that this makes me think of is, in a regular virtual team, one of the big challenges you see, and by regular I mean, this is not the COVID-19 world, but perhaps when you are sitting there as the team leader with 5 other team members, and you have 3 team members in different parts of the world who have, there's a risk of them being disconnected. I think it's very easy to lose track of what those potentially disconnected team members are doing, right? And to not really give them monitor them properly or give them proper inclusion or really kind of know what they're doing, right? And sometimes people who are remote in a virtual team setting feel like their bosses don't really understand what's going on, right? Don't really care about them, don't really know when they're working hard. So again, as part of the feedback process, being really positive about what they are contributing and showing that you see that and that you value that and how that contributes to the team as a whole, I think is a really important part of the process too.
Great. So we have a couple stories of people saying that they're having just a hard time motivating some people that are really good in the office face-to-face, but once they went to the virtual setting, really they're having a hard time motivating some of these team members. What would you recommend, or what would you consider that they take into effect these things of dealing with people that maybe just aren't as well off working from home than in an office setting?
Yeah, I mean, again, probably the starting point is just make sure that they are set up well, right? And so that these motivational issues, or what you're seeing as a motivational issue, is that, and isn't that they don't have the right technology, or there's too much distraction, or they don't have a workspace. Because if so, you've got to give a lot more slack, right? If there's something else going on there. I think even so, my own experience of this recently, I think you do just have to you have to trust more. That workers, will do, your employees or your team members will do what they need to do, and without as much oversight and as much micromanaging as you might normally want to do to make sure it was all happening. And that's tough as a team leader, particularly somebody if you're pretty hands-on normally, is just giving them the space to do that, even though you can't see them all day, is tough. I do think checking in at the beginning of the day, and if necessary at the end of the day, might be something you can think about. With my own team at the Lauder Institute, we have regular morning check-ins that are just a way of making sure that everybody is awake and motivated and ready to go in their day and feels connected, right? And so you might want to ramp that up a little bit if you have motivational issues for particular people. The other thing I think to do, if there really is a true motivational issue with, one or two people that is problematic for you, is just to really focus on goals, right? And so what is it that you want them to achieve by the end of the week, say, making that really clear, get that agreed with them at the beginning of the week, or and probably relatively short-term goals make sense in this setting. And just monitor them against their goals. Don't worry about whether you think they're working all day or not. The question is, do they achieve the goals that you're setting for them? And if not, and you've made those clear at the beginning of the week and they don't get to them by the end of the week, you have the basis for a kind of a stronger conversation around that. But focusing on the outcomes rather than the process is something that I think we kind of have to shift towards in a virtual team setting more than we might normally.
Great. So this will be our final question of the session. Now, Martine, a lot of people are just asking, is it really healthy overall to go to a complete virtual setting? I know the circumstances are different this time with the pandemic and everything, but if we did go to a complete virtual setting, is that healthy for everybody in the long run, do you think?
Time will tell to some extent, but no, I mean, I think it's not healthy in lots of ways for many people. For some people, it is, right? But I mean, we know that that working from home, working virtually, can cause, first of all, people get really lonely, right? And there's a that's happening now even more so because there's no other forms of social contact. But even normally, you're sort of working in isolation. It can be really stressful. There's actually evidence that people work harder when they're working remotely, often work longer hours. They don't, you don't have that clear separation between work and home. So I think it can be, it's not necessarily healthy. And for some people, certainly right now it isn't because it's stressful. There's a lot of stress for various reasons. And this is just one form of it, and where people are not properly set up at home and all sorts of stuff. I don't have the space and etc. But even if you are properly set up, I think, you need other forms of social contact or ways of connecting to compensate for if you're not getting it through work. But for some people, it is healthy, right? For some people, you really get to be more independent, to not have hour-long commutes on either side of your workday, to spend more time with your family and kids, to structure your work life a little bit differently, to maybe live out of the city rather than near your workplace, and so on. So I think it's really going to depend on the person and on the type of work you're doing. It's not going to work for everybody, but we'll probably find that it's going to work for more people are going to want it than wanted it before. I don't think that's going to be everybody by any means. But I think some people are kind of, enjoying what it brings, and for them it can be healthy. So yes, so many challenges, but also some benefits, I think for some people and for some workplaces. So I guess we are done with Q&A then. And if that's the case, thank you very much for your questions and for listening in. I really appreciate it. I'm going to finally hand it back to Mike just for some closing words.
Thank you, Martine. A wonderful presentation. And there were so many questions that we weren't able to answer. Maybe we can have you back in 9 months or 12 months to see what the new reality is at that time. Really appreciate your time and thoughts. And for all of those who can join us again next week, the same time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 1400 for the global audience in GMT. It's going to be Professor Segal Bashse speaking about emotional contagion, its impact in a crisis on your daily organizational life. Again, very relevant topic. Hope you can join us again next week. And again, Martine, thank you. Have a safe and prosperous week ahead. Bye-bye.